好厉害啊！一个小时抓的太棒了。我要认识他一下。没办法，就是。
Hello. Our next event is about to start. Hello, hello. Hello, people in the back. Without further introduction, let's welcome Vitalik.
Hello. Hello. Привет. So today I will be talking about a new kind of layer 2 construction. So something that's not quite the same thing as layer 2 is for scalability, like state channels and plasma, but also not really the same thing as existing layer 1s, but kind of something in between that basically uses blockchains as a place to store data, but does not actually do a computation on chain, and instead does computation using things like ZK snarks and other kinds of things. And I would call it, and the interesting thing about this is that once blockchains start becoming more scalable, and once Ethereum 2.0 and Serenity reach a certain point, it actually makes sense to make these kinds of applications that use blockchains for data, but not for computation in a lot of cases. So the idea of using blockchains as data layers actually has a long history. So this is a protocol that I actually worked for about 3 weeks back in 2013. It's called Mastercoin. And like, at the time, this was considered really innovative, right? So the idea is that Mastercoin created what I called a meta protocol on top of the Bitcoin blockchain. So sending a transaction in the Mastercoin protocol is sending a Bitcoin transaction. The transaction goes in the Bitcoin blockchain and gets verified by Bitcoin miners, except the Mastercoin protocol defines a completely different set of rules for interpreting what these transactions mean. So it uses the Bitcoin blockchain as a data store, but not as what we call a state execution engine. Now, if you have the Bitcoin blockchain and you have a master coin node, you can compute the master coin, the state pretty easily. You basically start with the genesis state, and then you would have some program that we call the state transition function. And you start with the genesis state, and then you just apply every single Bitcoin transaction in order. Most of the Bitcoin transactions don't have the kind of master coin flag on them, so they'll just do nothing. But the ones that do have the master coin flag on them will be interpreted, and they can do things kind of inside of the context of the master coin protocol that the Bitcoin protocol just completely ignores. So, inside of this master coin protocol, it defines MSC, the currency. You can do financial transactions. You can do a very primitive version of smart contracts and a lot of other things, right? So the reason, now, what's primitive about it, right? So first of all, the Mastercoin protocol is not light client friendly. So if you want to learn what the current state of the Mastercoin system is, then you basically have to actually have the Bitcoin blockchain, have the Mastercoin code, and process every single Bitcoin transaction with the Mastercoin flag attached to it in sequence. So there's no way to do a light client, there's no way to do simplified verification or anything. So this is the first problem. The second problem is that the activity inside of the Mastercoin protocol cannot influence any state outside of the Mastercoin meta protocol, right? So the Mastercoin protocol can handle Mastercoins. The Mastercoin protocol cannot handle Bitcoins. So this basically really limits the functionality that it has. So now we don't just have the Bitcoin protocol, we have the Ethereum protocol, and soon we will have the Ethereum 2.0 protocol. So a question you might want to ask is, can we try to use a similar idea? So try to use a kind of second layer protocol that just uses the blockchain as a place to store data, but does it differently in some ways so that you do not have these issues, right? About 4 months ago, I came up with this scheme that's now sometimes called ZK Rollup. Then a team from the Matter also made an implementation, and they called it Ignis. And then people from some other cryptocurrency projects called Ignis got upset, so then they called it Ignis Plasma. And then Plasma people got upset because it's not technically Plasma. If someone has a much better name for it, I think we all feel free to suggest it. But there's this idea called ZK Rollup / Ignis / whatever that basically increases scalability by a factor of 30 right now, and possibly a factor of more than 30 in the future. And it does this like that. It does it as follows, right? So first of all, you have a contract, so an Ethereum contract, and the contract storage only stores one value, which is the Merkle root of a Merkle tree. Now, inside of the Merkle tree, every single one of these values is just a pair of a public key and a balance. Now, users send transactions, and the transactions that users send have 13 bytes that basically say which account they're sending from, which account they're sending to, the value, the fee, and a nonce, and a signature. So users send these transactions, and then there's a class of node called a relayer. And what a relayer does is it gathers a set of transactions that users send, and it creates a ZK snark. And the ZK snark proves a few claims. Right, so the first claim that it proves is that if you start with a state that has some particular Merkle root, so we'll call the Merkle root R1, and then you apply all of the transactions from some set of transactions in order, and these transactions, then you get some other Merkle root R2, and this R2 is the root of some other state, which is the result of processing these transactions. And all of these transactions are valid, they lead to valid operations, and they have valid signatures attached. Then the relayer publishes R1, R2, and the set of all of the transactions to the chain, and the contract in the chain verifies that the snark actually says that these transactions are correct. So then once it does that, it just inside of the contract replaces its state and takes out sets the root from being R1 to being R2. So that's it, that's what the contract does. Right? Now, what does this give you? Now, first of all, this might seem like it's kind of similar to Plasma, right? Because in Plasma, you have a contract and the contract holds Merkle roots. Here you have a contract and the contract holds Merkle roots. So you might ask, well, what is the difference, right? And the difference is that Plasma needs to have a lot of complexity around things like exit games and the withdrawal periods because of this issue called the data availability problem, right? It needs to have a lot of complexity to deal with the possibility that a malicious Plasma operator published a block with a Merkle root but did not actually publish the data. If you publish incorrect data, that's not a big problem because you can just prove that the data is incorrect with a fraud proof to a smart contract. But if you just don't publish the data, then no one can tell whether or not the data is valid, is invalid, what's in there, and it's a kind of attack that's much harder to deal with. Now here, we don't have a data unavailability problem because all we're doing, what we're doing is that we actually have to publish all of the transactions to chain. Now notice that here we're publishing the transactions without the signature, right? So what that means is that for every single operation, you just have to publish 13 bytes. Now what's the gas cost of 13 bytes? Well, does anyone know how much gas it costs in Ethereum to include 1 byte in a transaction? 68. Does anyone know what 68 times 13 is? 884. Now, does anyone know how much gas it takes to send a transaction now? 21,000, right? So we've gone from 21,000 to 884. And so how are we doing this, right? Basically, the reason why we can get these efficiencies, I mean, the largest part of it is because instead of verifying transaction signatures instead of having the Ethereum blockchain itself verify the signature of every transaction, instead we use a ZK snark. And the ZK snark basically proves that all of these transactions actually are valid and have valid signatures attached. So we move the computation off chain, the relayer does the computation. We also save a lot of gas because the storage gets moved off chain as well. Right, so the storage gets moved off chain, the only thing that stays on chain is the Merkle root, but because the data is published on chain, we also manage to avoid depending on a central relayer. So we don't need to have a central operator the way Plasma chains do. And the reason basically is that because the data is published on chain, everyone knows how to compute the entire state tree. They can just process all of the transactions. And if they have the state tree, then if the original operator disappears, anyone else can just become a new operator in their place, right? So this is kind of the basic pattern of at least one way to kind of use the blockchain mostly just as a place to store data. Now, it turns out, by the way, that you can actually improve this even more. And the way that you improve this is that it turns out that you do not need to include the nonce on chain, right? Because the nonce is just there for verification. So if the nonce is there for verification, you don't need to know what the nonces of the transactions are in order to calculate the changes in the state roots. So we can actually go down from 13 bytes to 11 bytes. And so 11 times 68, well, 748. So yay, even more efficiency. So cost of roll-up transaction, way less than before. Now notice that, unlike Plasma, this scheme can process instant deposits and instant withdrawals. Now deposits and withdrawals are more expensive because they involve actually moving coins in and out of the system. But they're very easy to do, right? Basically, the way that you do a withdrawal is if you have an account, you provide a Merkle branch, and the Merkle branch proves that you have some state, then you can extract those coins, and the Merkle root gets changed with a new Merkle root where you don't have coins anymore. And the way that you would deposit is you provide a Merkle branch that shows where the highest index account is. You say how many coins you're adding, and it also changes the Merkle root, and it gives you a new account ID and a new index, and it changes the root. So depositing and withdrawing are both instant, and you can do it without an operator. And you don't need one central operator. Like the concept of a relayer is just something that there could be many relayers floating around the network. Anyone can participate. Now, this system could potentially increase scalability of the Ethereum blockchain for simple payments from about 15 transactions per second to up to 500. But one of the takeaways that we had from the ETH 1.x workshop that we had in Stanford a couple of months ago is that data in the Ethereum blockchain is actually overpriced, right? So basically what that means is that the gas cost that we're currently charging, 68 gas per byte, is actually kind of too expensive relative to the gas cost of the other operations. Right, so like for example, people are complaining about the state being large and processing the blockchain taking a long time, but actually like just adding, making blocks 1 kilobyte bigger, but just by itself doesn't actually make any of those problems much worse. Right, so even though the blockchain is in some ways kind of very close to the limits of its scalability, in terms of data, it looks like we can have a lot more data pretty safely. And so it's possible that in an upcoming hard fork, the gas cost would be reduced from 68 to something smaller. And if that's the case, then the scalability of this system could even go above 1,000 transactions a second. So taking rollup further, right? So what can we do with rollup? Well, first of all, we can support more complex state transition functions. It doesn't just have to be sending money from A to B. We could do a high-performance exchange inside of this. We could do Uniswap inside of it. We could have multiple tokens. We could try to do privacy-preserving computations. We could just do we could do ENS inside of it. You can do a whole bunch of different things inside of this kind of setup. And you can do it all using this kind of basic paradigm where you have an operator or relayers where relayers can update the Merkle tree root and basically publish enough information that lets people compute the entire tree themselves. So, so today I would like to introduce, ta-da, ZK rollup.
The size is one size.
Oh, sorry. What? Okay, ZK rollup. Now, if we have to name these things after states of matter, I'm going to call this Bose-Einstein condensate, but ZK rollup sounds better. So, the idea here basically is that we're going to try to take the same kind of rollup-based approach, but we're going to kind of make a mini version of Zcash inside of this. Right, so here's how you make a mini version of Zcash. So generally, users publish transactions that contain snarks that say, I have a valid spend certificate for some coin hash in the state, and here's a new coin hash that I'm creating, and here's a kind of unique value that I'm revealing. And generally, one way to think about it is that a user's secret, which never gets revealed, is some number s. The coin hash is the hash of s+1, and the spend certificate is the hash of s+2. So what the snark does is it basically says, when you publish a spend certificate, it proves that the spend certificate is connected to the coin hash of one of the coin hashes that already is in the Merkle tree, and that's it. Right, so it proves that the spend certificate is connected to one of the existing coins, but it doesn't say which one. The other important thing is that the verification function should also check that the spend certificate itself has not yet been revealed. Right, so every coin has only one corresponding valid spend certificate, and so if you reveal a spend certificate, then you should not be able to use that spend certificate again. And this is kind of the basic way that it ensures this property of like one coin goes in, one coin comes out, while at the same time giving you kind of total privacy within the set of users of the system. So the transaction doesn't reveal which coin is spending. Each spend certificate can only be used once. So this is like basically a simple version of Zcash. Well, how do we do it inside of a rollup? So what we're going to do is we're going to say, instead, like a transaction here is just basically going to say, here are the spend certificates I'm claiming, here are some new coin hashes, here's the values of these coin hashes, here's a snark, here's some other data. But the real layer isn't going to be publishing the transactions. The real layer is going to be publishing, for every transaction, a receipt. And a receipt is basically just a minimal object that defines what is the change to the state that it's making. Because you don't actually need to publish the transactions. All you need is to publish enough data to allow anyone who wants to construct the tree up to the current point. And so the receipt would contain, well, first of all, 2 spend certificates. So assuming this is a UTXO system, so 32 bytes for one, 32 bytes for one. The values of the new coins, so we'll make them be 4 bytes for efficiency, and then we'll have a fee, which might be 1 byte. And if you want to create a bunch of new coins, well, it turns out you don't need 32 times n bytes, you only need 32 bytes, basically because instead of publishing all of the new coins, you just publish the hash of a root hash of your new coins, and then the transaction that spends those coins would have to provide a Merkle branch. So altogether, we have basically 105 bytes multiplied by 68 and about 7,100 gas per transaction. So still cheaper per transaction than simple dumb Ethereum transactions, but fully privacy preserving. Yay, ZK roll up. So these are intended as just kind of examples of the kinds of efficiencies that you can get. And the reason why we get these efficiencies is because all of these systems involve some pretty heavy computation, right? Like if you try to just do Zcash on chain, then one of these transactions would involve verifying a snark. And verifying a snark involves like something like 500,000 gas. Now here what we're doing is we're not requiring the chain to verify a snark for every transaction. We're not even putting the snark on chain. Instead, we're putting one single snark, where one single snark verifies that for every transaction that gets included, there is a snark attached. So it does require one level of recursion, so it requires a snark of a set of snarks. But what you get out of that is that the cost of verifying these things goes down from what it would be, which is maybe 500,000, to what it could be here, which is about 7,000. So now this all sounds good, right? This is like, yay, if we use things like snarks, or potentially you can modify these systems to use kind of Truebit-style interactive verification. If you do these wonderful things, then you can increase scalability by a factor of somewhere between 30 and 100. But okay, well, what if we want to do more? So here's where Ethereum 2.0 comes in, right? So the phase 1 of the Ethereum 2.0 beacon chain is the phase that introduces sharding of data, right? So phase 1 basically says we're going to turn on these 1,024 shards. Each of these shards will have a block size. It looks like the block size will be 16 kilobytes every 6 seconds. And these shards would basically just contain data, and the data doesn't necessarily mean anything. So let's say you have this architecture. Well, it looks like all we've created is we've just created a chain that lets people throw 2.8 megabytes a second of junk onto it, right? Well, turns out we can do a lot of things with the junk. So for example, well, how about we do ZK rollup on top of it, right? Every ZK rollup transaction is marginally 105 bytes, 2.8 megabytes a second of data availability, 2.8 million divided by 105, that sounds like it's about 27,000. And yay, we got 27,000 privacy preserving transactions a second. So Now, and if we don't care about privacy, well, we can increase that by probably another factor of 10. Yay! Wow. I don't know. I was going to make a snarky comment about how that's more than the scam coins have been pretending, but I couldn't decide which scam coin to call out. Okay, so this is what we could do, right? But there's a bit of a barrier. And the barrier is that these systems that I talked about here, right, they don't, like, all of these systems rely on data, but they do also rely on a computation layer. They rely on, now the computation layer can be pretty tiny. The computation layer basically just needs to verify a snark, but it still requires computation. And in phase 1, Ethereum 2.0 is not going to have computation. Now, Ethereum 1.0 has computation already, right? And so Ethereum 1.0 has computation, Ethereum 2.0 has lots of data. Well, it sounds like we might need a bridge between the two. And so this is what, fortunately, we can have ETH2 Lite clients inside of ETH1. So we've spent quite a bit of time designing the Ethereum 2.0 protocol to make it maximally light client friendly. And the way that we do this is basically we have this architecture where if you've already authenticated some particular block, then from that block you can basically use Merkle branches to authenticate a committee. So you can use them to authenticate a random subset of validators. And then you can use this committee to then verify signatures of blocks in the future. Right? So basically this is the committee that will be used in the future to sign shard blocks. And so you can then use through these shard blocks, you can authenticate future beacon chain blocks, and so you can verify signatures. And when you're verifying signatures, you verify them against the validator set that you've authenticated against your existing block header, and so you've now authenticated your way up to a new block header. So in terms of the data complexity of all of this, it's actually surprisingly tame. Like basically, about every 9 days when the persistent committee switch, you would need to authenticate a new validator set, and that is about 80 kilobytes. But you don't really even have to do the 80 kilobytes all at once. If you want, you can kind of amortize it over the 9 days. And then if every time you want to authenticate a new header, you would need about 500 bytes for the new header. So you can almost do this in the Ethereum 1.0 chain as it is today. The main challenge is that the Ethereum 2.0 chain is using BLS 12381, and the Ethereum 1 chain does not have a good precompile for BLS 12381. And so if this gets added in the next fork, then that problem gets solved. So what this basically means is that you can have the Ethereum 1 chain be the computation layer and then hook into the Ethereum 2 chain and require the data for these roll-up schemas we published on the Ethereum 2 chain, and then we can actually pretty quickly start to get these very large scalability gains. So there's plenty of other things that you can do with data availability engines. You don't just, it's not just about doing rollups. You can have plasma chains with much more frequent commitments. So you can have plasma chains that make blocks every minute instead of say every day. You can have dApps that store messages on chain. You can have blockchain protocols that have their own kind of independent or sort of code sovereign state transition functions. So you can have kind of mastercoin style protocols, but where they piggyback on the Ethereum chain for data availability. Right? So you can kind of do this a scalable version of this mastercoin protocol type thing, where you do just stick the data for your protocol on shards. You use the Ethereum chain for data availability, but then everything else is up to you. So that's one example of a kind of a layer 2 that for computation. I also wanted to bring up a different kind of example of a layer 2 for computation. So speeding up cross-shard transactions, right? So one weakness of the current design for the Ethereum 2.0 sharded chain is that communication between different shards has a fairly long delay. right? So if you're doing things within one shard, then you have a shard block that comes every 6 seconds, and it's all nice and good. If you want to do things between two shards, then basically you have this approach where you do something on one shard, then you have to wait until there's a crosslink, then the crosslink makes it into the beacon chain, and then you have a shard block that points to a block in the beacon chain that contains the crosslink, and then after like one epoch, your receipt from the first shard makes it into the second shard. So 6 minutes to move ETH or to make operations between one shard and another at layer 1. That's a bit too long. So can we make it faster? And it turns out that there's like a set of layer 2 techniques that we can use to make it faster pretty easily. So here's how the layer 2 technique works, right? Basically, what we do is like the simplest way to explain this is that you can think of it think of like a token implementing this kind of scheme, but you can generalize this to smart contracts, you can generalize this to everything. So here's how it works. Let's say that at the top we have shard 1, and at the top, Alice has some number of coins and Bob has some number of coins. At the bottom we have a different shard. And in a different shard we have Alice, Bob, and Charlie, and they have coins. Now, at the beginning, Alice has 10 coins, Bob has 20 coins, Charlie has 30 coins. And at that exact point in time, on the other shard, there's a transaction that sends 5 more coins to Bob. So what happens, right? So at the beginning, Alice has 10, Bob has 20, Charlie has 30. At the end, Alice has 10, Bob has 25, Charlie has 30, which is what should happen. But can we give Bob access to his coins faster? So here's what we do. Let's suppose that we have some mechanism that allows one shard to see the roots of another shard that doesn't need to work all the time, but that does work most of the time. So one example would be that you can just require someone, you can allow people to publish roots along with a security deposit, right? So they can publish a transaction into a smart contract that says, I claim the Merkle root on this shard is 0x12345, and I agree to lose 100 ether if my claim is wrong. Then you publish this into a smart contract, and now you have a kind of claim that says the Merkle root on the other shard looks like it's probably this value. Now there's still some small chance the claim is wrong, but if a guy's willing to put 100 ether behind it, the claim is probably not wrong, right? So what you do is basically you say in the token, like inside of the registry that stores the token balances, you would define Alice's balance as still being 10, Charlie still being 30. Now for Bob, instead of his balance being a number, his balance becomes this kind of conditional object that says, if the state root of the other shard is R, I have 25 coins. If the state root of the other shard is not R, I have 20 coins. So it's kind of like representing a quantum superposition inside of a smart contract, if that helps anyone at all.
No.
No, okay. But basically, like, the contract itself kind of stores both states, right? It stores both possibilities. And then only later, when the contract figures out like what is the actual root of the other shard, then it knows, like, does Bob actually have 25 coins, or does Bob actually have 20 coins? So now here's the interesting thing about this. Let's say Bob has 25 if R else 20 coins. And let's say Bob wants to send 22 coins to Charlie. Well, Bob can do that, right? So let's say Bob wants to do that over here. Then Bob's balance becomes 3 if R else 20, and Charlie's balance becomes 52 if R else 30, right? So you can just have these kind of superpositions propagate. And so if that happens, then Charlie's wallet can see, oh look, my balance is now 52 if R else 30. Well, I'm going to decide for myself. Does it look like, from my outside point of view, does it look like R is the root of this, is the root hash of this shard? If it is, then my wallet is going to show my balance as being 52, and if not, my wallet is going to show my balance as being 30. So even though inside the state, it's doing this funky stuff with weird superpositions, from a user interface kind of high-level abstracted point of view, it just looks like Bob and Charlie are getting their coins and have the ability to spend their coins almost instantly. So this is like another example of the kind of thing layer 2s can do. A third interesting example is, okay. I just want to go one slide back. No, go back one. Nope, no. Okay. Yeah, this is the original shard, so slide, so one forward. Can we do one forward?
Next one.
There we go. So another thing that you can do with layer 2 is you can do kind of general purpose privacy in different ways. So there was this framework that was introduced by Alessandro Ortiz and some other researchers a few months ago that they called Zexi, that basically creates a kind of does a UTXO-based general purpose smart contract architecture that allows privacy preserving smart contracts, and does this in a way that kind of actually looks and feels nice. So you can do this, and basically this is like another example of what I would call a computational layer 2, right? So the way that this would actually get implemented is that you would have these transactions go on chain and they would have snarks, but like ultimately it is a kind of a different, like people are programming in a totally different environment from the kind of basic environment that the Ethereum 2.0 blockchain would provide. So so these are just different kinds of examples of things that I personally would call layer 2 computation. So what are the benefits of this paradigm, right? So philosophically here, the idea basically is that layer 1, the Ethereum blockchain's layer 1 does not need to be overly complex to optimize its properties. It does not need to increase complexity to optimize block time, to optimize cross-shard communication time, to optimize cross-shard synchronous messaging support, to optimize privacy. Basically, layer 1 really does not need that much change. And like theoretically, I might even go so far as to claim that Ethereum 2.0 phase 3 is like possibly just sufficient pretty much forever. And with 2 exceptions, one of them is that you would want to increase the shard count eventually, and the second is that eventually it wants to upgrade if the cryptography breaks. But like aside from things like that, it looks like you can do pretty much anything that you need on layer 2, right? Now, there are obviously like other blockchains that have made this claim, but like basically what I would argue is that once you have scalable data availability and enough expressivity at least to be able to verify things like ZK snarks and verify basic state transitions, then as long as you like pass some minimal threshold of kind of power and some minimal threshold of complexity, then you actually can kind of build these layers on top and do all of the kind of upgrades that you need to do from there. Right? So we don't even need to do kind of Ethereum 3.0 super quadratic sharding. There's a lot of things that we kind of don't need to do if we decide to do, but we manage to do this kind of layer 2 approach for scalability and privacy and kind of usability innovation instead. And so that's kind of, so this is kind of a possible long-term roadmap for the Ethereum ecosystem, right? So basically, like over time, it's possible that layer 1 is just going to be harder and harder to change. But if that happens, then that's all fine because, well, we can do so many cool things with these computational layer 2s, and computational layer 2s actually become really friendly and really easy to make and use if your base layer, you're building them on top of scalable base layer data availability. So if you have data availability of, in this case, we'll start off with 2.8 megabytes a second, and potentially, like you might have forks to increase it over time. But like if you have even that much, then there's just a huge number of cool things that you can build on top in different ways. Thank you. Yay, questions. Yes.
Yeah, just on the layer 2 computation to scale, that doesn't that preclude like Turing complete languages? I thought that doesn't work with the ZK snarks.
So there's a difference between like basically when mathematicians talk about Turing completeness, they actually mean a different thing than what the crypto community means when they talk about Turing completeness. And like we should all really use a language not the way the mathematicians do. Like basically, Turing completeness as mathematicians use it basically means that you computational languages that are so general that you can't tell when the computation is going to halt. And that's something that you can't do with a snark, because with a snark you have to know ahead of time how many steps it's going to take. The thing that kind of crypto people sometimes accidentally use the word Turing complete to mean is basically kind of being expressive enough to be able to express applications that have complex internal state. So to be able to express things like Plasma, things like MakerDAO, things like Uniswap, and whatever, even like the verification engines for these layer 2s and things like that. And like Bitcoin, for example, is definitely not powerful to do that. Ethereum, for example, is powerful enough to do that. And Zexi is a UTXO-based model, but it also is powerful enough to do that. So now, Turing complete is really the wrong word to use for this stuff, but it is the case that you can do things that are expressive enough for the applications you want to build inside of ZK Snarks. Yes.
Can I ask something before this, before Serenus? Yeah, I mean, in the bear market, we have we are reducing the hash power. Maybe we lost maybe 30% hash power. And what do you think about, because we are going to POS express sharding, and the less hash power is less security. What do you think about this, and how can our community to solve this problem? Because lower hash power and lower security.
I mean, it's definitely a challenge, an issue. Though I would say that Ethereum's current level of hash power is not close to being low enough that we need to worry about it. So like, for example, the Ethereum Classic chain has been attacked, and we know that's one of the most powerful chains that has been attacked, but the Ethereum Classic chain only has like something like 3% of the hash power that the Ethereum chain has. So like, there is still a pretty wide margin between the two. I mean, if it turns out that the Ethereum chain becomes attackable in say more than 6 months from now, then another thing that we can do is once phase 0 is launched, we can actually modify the proof of work clients to basically treat the phase 0 proof of stake as being a finality mechanism. And if you do that, then 51% attacks on the proof of work chain can't revert finalized blocks anymore. The only thing they can do is censor blocks. So that would also reduce the risk in the system by making 51% attacks less dangerous if they do happen. Yes?
Sounds like that there's always conversation of the degree of decentralization between blockchain layer and application layer. I mean, when you want to make the blockchain more lightweight, then we need a snark relayer and we need data provider and somehow make that application layer more centralized.
That is true. One of the reasons why I think this class of layer 2 that I talk about today is interesting is that because it doesn't need to solve data availability problems, the level of application layer centralization is actually reduced by a lot. So for example, like if you compare Plasma versus Rollup, right? In Plasma, because you have this data availability problem, you need to have an operator, and then if the operator is malicious, the operator can't steal your coins, but the operator can't make everyone waste their time getting their coins back for 2 weeks. Whereas with Rollup, like because there isn't a data availability issue, if one relayer disappears, another relayer can just immediately pop in and take their place. So the amount of harm that a malicious relayer can do is like much lower in rollup versus in something like Plasma. So now, I mean, I do agree that kind of being like too open to centralization at layer 2 is risky, but I would argue that like layer 2s of this kind in particular are more a part of the solution than a problem. Yes?
First of all, thanks for your talk, and I think the idea of having conditional state is really fascinating. And I was wondering, are you guys considering about like something like two-phase commit protocol when doing cross-shard transactions?
So we have something called contract yanking, which is one way of like solving what we call trade and hotel problems. Like basically the idea is that if you want to interact with two objects that are on two different shards, then you first take one send a transaction to take one object and move it from one shard to another, and then that might fail, it might succeed. Only if it succeeds, you do then you have two objects on the same shard. You can do one thing synchronously with them. Now, people have talked about the idea of like, should the Ethereum blockchain support kind of like actually synchronous cross-shard activity at layer 1? And so far, I think our answer has been, like, we've thought about it, and the answer has been no so far, basically because it would introduce too much complexity. Like, the idea is that right now, like in between two crosslinks, you can basically define, like, calculate the state transitions of a shard as just being a function of the data in that shard and the beacon chain, and it doesn't like depend on anything that happens in other shards. And so, if we were to have like base layer synchronous cross-shard calls, then it would break that invariant, and it would make the state calculation game much more complicated. But the good news is that you can. I'm quite sure that you can make a layer 2 for it. Like you can basically use the same kinds of techniques that I talk about here, and just make a layer 2 that supports synchronous cross-shard calls.
Thank you.
These days there is lots of third-party layer 2 solution for the Ethereum. For example, the Sierra is just launching as the launchpad of Balance. And what is the relationship between those third-party layer 2 solution with the Ethereum layer 2 solution?
So Stellar is a state channel system. So it basically is, it is one of these kind of, or like, it is part of the kind of layer 2 that provides its own data availability solution. So it is like it does involve data being off-chain, and state channels like have their own benefits. So probably the biggest one is that they support instant transactions, and that's like state channels are one kind of layer 2. Plasma is another kind of layer 2, and they're both part of this larger kind of group of layer 2s that try to handle data availability issues themselves with the data on-chain. What I talked about here are the layer 2s that do computation off-chain that have data availability all being handled by the chain because all of the data is on-chain. So it's a different kind of thing with different trade-offs.
有人想问中文的吗？ Alright, so thank you, Vitalik. Thank you, everyone.
Hello， 请工作人员，就是以太坊相关的工作人员可以来前面一趟吗？我们来一个小小的合照，谢谢。 好，到这边到前面讲台前面。先讲刚刚的画面。
他的，他自己在录吗？我现在也在录。可以，对。
Hello，台北以太坊社群的工作人员邱俊以及陈品。
好久不见哦，在这里啦，
我们要快速合照一张，因为他们要快闪了，所以立刻想要合照的立刻到志成这边，到梁志成这边集合。台北以太坊社群的干部们 ，please。只有这次机会哦。好，快。TV 邱俊那些人，对，拍照时间。好，准备好了吗？重要干部出场。
合照。
还有谁？场务在吗？场务。小维。Nicholas。查理。谢。永成。还在吗？好，那就这样喽，我要拍喽 ，OK。